Good evening, everyone. We're just going to give folks a couple of minutes to get logged into Zoom here, and then we'll get started shortly. All right. Looks like we've got lots of folks filing in here. So we might as well go ahead and get started. So welcome, everybody. To start, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I am on Treaty 6 territory, and I acknowledge the many First Nations and Métis whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. I honor and respect the elders of the past, the present, and the future. And I ask that since we are dispersed throughout Alberta for this evening's webinar, that each one of us personally acknowledges the Indigenous peoples of your region. I would also like to humbly acknowledge that the recent discoveries of unmarked grave sites at residential schools across Canada tells a truth long known. We know these discoveries open wounds for many people, and our hearts are heavy for the lost children, their families, and the survivors living with the news of these findings. So I would like to welcome everybody to the North Saskatchewan Region Surface Water Quality Management Framework Engagement Webinar. My name is Janine Higgins, and I'm an Engagement and Education Specialist with Alberta Environment and Parks, and I will be your facilitator for the session this evening. So just so you're aware, this session is being recorded and will later be posted onto our YouTube account. So for this evening, we're going to be going through some housekeeping items to start off before I pass it off to our lead presenter, Sarah DePoe, for a presentation on the North Saskatchewan Region Surface Water Quality Management Framework. After that, we are going to be moving into a question and answer session before we close the webinar this evening at 8 p.m. So for our question and answer section, you should see down at the bottom of your screen, there's a black bar that has Q&A. And if you click on that Q&A, it's going to open up that tool for you this evening. And so in the Q&A, that's where you can type in all of your questions that you have throughout the presentation this evening. And for tonight, we are going to be using our upvoting tool as well. So if you see other questions that are coming in, you'll be able to upvote them if you would like to hear an answer to them. So that's just one of the ways that we're going to be sorting through our questions for our session tonight. And so we also asked for some pre-submitted questions when you registered for the webinar as well. So we are going to be responding to as many of those as possible and starting off our Q&A session with 3 of those questions as well. So because everybody can see all of the questions that are being submitted with our upvoting tool, any inappropriate questions will be deleted. So keep it clean tonight, folks. I'm sure it won't be a problem, but just keep in mind that if we have similar questions, we may group them or paraphrase them so that we can group them together to provide responses to as many as possible. And in the event, if there's a question that we actually can't answer tonight, we're going to defer it, and then we will respond to it through our engagement webpage. So on alberta.ca, where you registered for this webinar and where you see all the other resources related to this engagement, we will post responses to the questions that we're not able to answer there. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel for this evening. So as I mentioned, we have Sarah DePoe, who is our Director of Cumulative Effects Management Planning, who you're going to hear from for our presentation tonight. And then we've got a whole bunch of subject matter experts who are going to be providing responses through our question and answer later this evening. So from the North Saskatchewan region, we have Greg and John. From Watershed Sciences, we have John Orwin and Cecilia. So 2 Johns this evening. Jacqueline Schmidt, you won't see on the screen right now, but she will be joining us a little bit later. So you will see her on the panel when we move into our Q&A. And then from Land Use Planning, we have Kim, Chantel, Alex, and Eleanor. So a whole bunch of folks here to be able to provide responses to your great questions that we'll hear this evening. So with that, I would like to pass it off to Sarah, who is going to take us through our presentation this evening.
Excellent. Thank you, Janine. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. If you've joined us, it's because you have an interest in learning about the development of the surface water quality management framework for the North Saskatchewan region, and that's great. In the webinar today, we're going to be discussing what a surface water quality management framework is. And we're going to be talking about what it adds to our environmental management system. We'll be talking about some of the key components of the framework, and we'll be talking about how it would work once it's implemented. Some of you online might be familiar with environmental management frameworks, while for others it might be new. It's our desire in this webinar that by listening to this webinar, it'll help you provide input back to Alberta Environment and Parks on the development of this framework. If you have questions, we're hoping that you'll feel free to ask. There is an online survey that'll be open until September 17th, through which we're actively seeking your input. Before we start talking about the framework itself, we thought it would be important to introduce you to the region. North Saskatchewan Region, shown here, is one of the 7 land use planning regions in Alberta. It covers over 86,000 square kilometers, or around 13% of Alberta's land base. In terms of population centers, it includes Nordegg, Rocky Mountain House, and Drayton Valley in the west. In the central part of the region, you'll find Edmonton and Camrose. And then moving to the east, you'll find Vermilion and Lloydminster. It's a very large and very diverse landscape. 2 of Alberta's major rivers flow through this region, and you can see them shown in blue. The North Saskatchewan River to the north, and then the Battle River to the south. Both these rivers would be managed under the proposed surface water quality management framework. The North Saskatchewan River is a mountain-fed river system. Its headwaters are in the Rocky Mountains, and it originates from the Saskatchewan Glacier and the Columbia ice fields. It flows through the eastern slopes and the foothills. This area that you see here is valued for recreation, such as fishing, rafting, canoeing, and kayaking, but it's also a pristine environment that provides source water for drinking for many Albertans. Moving downstream, the North Saskatchewan River flows eastward and passes through the town of Rocky Mountain House, another popular destination for recreation. This inset photo is in reference to the Rocky Mountain House National Historic Site on the banks of the North Saskatchewan River. This reference is intended to respectfully acknowledge the long history and ongoing Indigenous use within this region. Next, we see the river flowing through Edmonton, our province's capital city, that's home to well over 1 million people if you consider the greater metropolitan area. Edmonton's river valley is full of walking trails and pedestrian bridges that are enjoyed by residents and visitors alike, like the one shown in the photo inset. The North Saskatchewan River then winds northeast and crosses out of Alberta, north of the city of Lloydminster. This is a photo that I took this weekend of the expansive North Saskatchewan River near Heinsberg, getting close to the Saskatchewan-Alberta border. Across the border, the North Saskatchewan River is joined by the Battle River. We've shown some fish here, just to note that fishing is also one of the activities that people enjoy on these rivers. Moving over to the Battle River, would note that this is a unique river system, as it's a prairie-fed river with its headwaters in the central part of the province near Battle Lake. Here you can see the landscape of the Battle River watershed at Big Knife Provincial Park east of Buffalo Lake and south of the village of Forestburg. If you're driving by the Battle River, you'll recognize it by the beautiful ribbons of green crossing agricultural landscapes with healthy riparian areas that support a broad range of plant and animals, including this moose that could be spotted by paddlers. Healthy riparian areas play an important role in filtering runoff from agricultural fields before it enters the river. Together, these 2 rivers are valued for tourism, for recreation, for swimming, for boating, for fishing, for supporting healthy aquatic life, for providing source water for people and livestock, for supporting traditional land uses, and providing habitat for a wide variety of plants and animals. Having clean water running through our rivers is something that we value as Albertans, and today we're going to talk about the quality of the water in these rivers and how to manage it. So now that we're situated, let's talk about the framework. You might be wondering, why a surface water quality management framework? All human activities can affect Alberta's water resources and aquatic ecosystems. And some examples of those human activities will be ones that you'll see day to day. One moment, there we go. This activity includes things on our landscape, such as cities and towns that continue to grow as our population increases. Roadways, agricultural lands, including croplands and livestock operations, forest harvest areas, aggregate or other mining, and industrial development. This development supports a thriving economy and the quality of life of Albertans. We manage these activities individually, often through stewardship and best management practices, but also through policies, plans, and our regulatory system. But it's also important to be managing them collectively. Under our surface water quality management framework, we're taking a cumulative effects management approach, which means we're looking at managing water quality considering all human activities that can affect water quality in these two watersheds. So that includes both point sources and non-point sources. This approach is intended to ensure our environment is protected and sustained into the future, so we can continue to have clean water for drinking, recreating, industrial, agricultural, and human use. Understanding cumulative effects is essential to making informed decisions about land and water management and resource development. Well, what will surface water quality management framework do? It's essentially going to establish an approach to monitoring and managing the long-term cumulative impacts of human activities on water quality in the main stem rivers of this region. Surface water quality management frameworks aren't new. There are two surface water quality management frameworks that already exist in regions of the province, including the Lower Athabasca region, shown in the northeast portion of the province, and the South Saskatchewan region in the southern portion of the province. Alberta Environment and Parks is now proposing completing two additional surface water quality management frameworks, one for the North Saskatchewan region and Battle Rivers, and another for the Upper Athabasca region. Similar to other frameworks, these frameworks will adopt a plan, do, check cycle. It's an adaptive management approach. What we'll do is establish a regular cycle of monitoring, evaluating, and reporting water quality conditions at the regional scale. We'll be creating a clear process to respond to current or emerging water quality issues in the river. We'll be setting indicators and management thresholds that are used to determine whether we're achieving regional objectives. And we'll be requiring that decision makers consider the findings from the framework reporting in land and natural resource decisions. Surface water quality management frameworks add to the system. They don't replace any existing, they don't replace anything in our existing system of environmental management. They provide that regional scale and cumulative effects management perspective. The overall water quality management system in Alberta operates at multiple scales, from the provincial level policies down to local level project approvals. At the provincial level, we have high-level strategic policy direction that comes from Alberta's Water for Life strategy, as well as the land use framework. The land use framework provides important enabling direction for regional scale cumulative effects management. Nested within the sub-regional scale, you'll often find Within the regional scale, you'll often find sub-regional scale management plans. At the local or project level, water quality is primarily managed through operating approvals under the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act. But other legislation, such as the Water Act, Agricultural Operations and Practices Act, or Forest Act, may also come into play depending on the activity. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention watershed stewardship. Regional initiatives from organizations such as watershed planning and advisory councils and watershed stewardship groups help to contribute to watershed health. There's a long history of stewardship in the North Saskatchewan and Battle River watersheds. The NSWA, I understand, just celebrated its 20th birthday, and the Battle River Watershed Alliance was established over a decade ago. There have been state-of-the watershed reports, watershed management plans created for many of the watersheds of the region, most recently the Sturgeon River Water Management Plan. WPACs have an important role to play in both framework development and implementation. So now let's shift gears a little bit to talk about the key components of a surface water quality management framework. I'm going to be walking through 5 components of a framework. In addition to being place-based, these frameworks are also outcomes-based. And this is where we'll rely on these regional objectives to clearly state our desired end result and give the direction for the surface water quality management framework. Each surface water quality management framework has a regional objective that reflects the needs of the region and determines how water quality should be managed. The proposed regional objective for the surface water quality management framework for the North Saskatchewan region is stated here. And it is surface water quality in the North Saskatchewan and Battle Rivers is managed so current and future water quality is maintained or improved. So when we're talking about maintaining or improving water quality, often we start thinking about our current water quality conditions. The current water quality in these 2 rivers is a reflection of a combination of factors. So natural factors, whether the river is either mountain fed or prairie fed, as well as some of the human influences on the river. In the North Saskatchewan River, water quality has generally improved over the last couple of decades, largely due to improvements in municipal wastewater treatment. Conditions are generally good, with some work being done on emerging issues or issues related to non-point source contributions or understanding impacts of things like road salts or pesticides on water quality. In the Battle River, runoff and flows in the Battle are more limited due to the flatter prairie headwaters. It has slower moving water, and the water is naturally alkaline and nutrient rich. Because of this, there's increased vulnerability to contaminant loading and a higher likelihood of low dissolved oxygen concentrations under ice due to high nutrient levels. In terms of this proposed regional objective, we wanted to re-articulate that this objective aligns with what we've heard through past discussions on water management in the region. It's consistent with existing frameworks, agreements, and plans. Worth noting is the water management framework for the Industrial Heartland and Capital Region established in 2013. This is developed collaboratively with municipal governments, utilities, industry, and the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, and spoke to an objective about there being no further deterioration of water quality and ultimately improvement in water quality conditions into the future. This maintain or improve regional objective does not preclude further development in the North Saskatchewan region. The type and scale of development proposed, the best management practices employed, innovation, and collaborative efforts will all dictate how development opportunities can be considered into the future. So with that objective of maintaining or improving water quality in these rivers, we need to understand some indicators that can be monitored and tracked over time to assess water quality conditions. This table shows some examples of what those might be. They may include nutrients, metals, major ions, bacteria, or even pesticides. Establishing these indicators and continuing to track them over time is reliant upon our current long-term surface water quality monitoring system. Here you can see a photo of Alberta Environment and Park staff out collecting river water samples. They're then sent to the lab so they can be tested for some of those key parameters. Surface water quality is monitored on major rivers across the province, which you can see on the map here, and there's some augmented monitoring that occurs at tributaries. All these sources of data and information are very useful to framework development. In terms of the framework itself, we're going to be relying on 3 of the long-term river network stations, monitoring stations. 3 of them are located on the North Saskatchewan River, and 2 of them are located on the Battle River. Sampling occurs monthly for a core suite of water quality parameters at each one of these stations. The location of these stations is considered representative, provides a representative example of water quality for that reach of the river. Before I move on, I should mention that this sampling is by no means all the water quality sampling that's done within this watershed. More specific water and ecosystem monitoring is underway in the North Saskatchewan River Basin through the Watershed Monitoring Program, which is a collaborative monitoring program between the Alberta government, EPCOR, NSWA, and the City of Edmonton. So how do we select indicators that we include in the framework? There's a rigorous process that we go through and several criteria that we consider, which I'm going to introduce to you now. Indicators are selected considering some of the availability of historical data from the monitoring network. Using historical data and information is important to determine whether water quality is maintained into the future or whether it's changing. In some cases, we find that we don't have enough data for some new or emerging substances of concern to incorporate them as indicators at this time. It's also important that the indicators selected in the framework are reflective of the land use pressures within the watershed and that the indicators can be directly influenced by management actions. We might be more inclined to select indicators that have shown increases at particular stations or have shown exceedances of certain water quality guidelines, as it suggests that management may be necessary. We've also looked to identify and select indicators that are consistent with some existing agreements and reports. So you'll see alignment with some of the indicators that were identified in the Industrial Heartland and Capital Region Water Management Plan, and also see some agreement in the indicators with our Prairie Province's Water Board agreements, the border. Lastly, we're very interested in feedback through this engagement process to make sure that we've got this indicator selection right. Ultimately, once we have the indicators selected, we're going to use the data that's available to establish historical conditions, and we're going to use that information on the historical conditions to establish management thresholds into the future. Before we move on to management thresholds, I wanted to show you this crosswalk table that shows the link between the categories of the indicators that you'll find within the framework and some of the activities and pressures that we have on the landscape in these two watersheds. So in some cases, you'll find that that indicators can be associated with all land use pressures. So a general indicator such as total suspended solids could be reflective of land use activities, including urban activity, agricultural activity, forestry, industrial activity, oil and gas, or surface mining. Other pesticide indicators may be selected very specifically connected to certain land uses. So for example, 2,4-D was selected as to be responsive to agricultural activity. And biological indicators, the biological indicator E. coli could be linked back to urban or agricultural use. In total, there's approximately 20 indicators that have been selected for each river. There's an individual indicator list for this North Saskatchewan River and another for the Battle River. The indicators fall into these key categories: general indicators such as suspended sediment, major ions such as chloride, bacterial indicators such as E. coli, nutrients including phosphorus and nitrogen, metals including lead, mercury, and selenium, and organic indicators such as pesticides. We're engaging on this list and the selection criteria to get input on whether we got it right or whether we need to make changes. Moving on, we'll talk about the management thresholds. So under the framework, we set management thresholds to assess water quality condition over time. We have two types of thresholds that I'd like to introduce. Limits are the levels at which the risk of adverse effects on environmental quality are unacceptable. We set limits based on the most stringent water quality guidelines that exist for a given indicator. These represent the upper bound, which is not to be crossed. We don't want to see conditions in the river exceeding the limit concentrations. Under the framework, we also set triggers, which are early warning signal. These triggers are set based on historical data, and they give us an indication of whether water quality is changing relative to what it's been in the past. As I mentioned, the limits in the framework are set on the most stringent water quality guidelines. We draw these from the environmental quality guidelines for Alberta surface waters that are set for Alberta, which is also includes the advice from the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. The limits that we establish for the indicators in the framework stay the same at every station. So for each one of the 5 stations, the limit values for an individual indicator will remain the same. The accompanying thresholds that we use are called triggers. These triggers are site-specific as they're based on historical data from each of the monitoring sites. Generally, we are looking for 10 years of data so that the historical record encompasses a range of conditions. So we want to include information on wet and dry years, so it gives us a good understanding of what is normal within any given site. So here we've got a graph which is meant to represent that historical data period. So we'll be looking at those data and we'll be calculating some statistics. One of the statistics that we calculate is called a median value, and that we use this median value to establish our median trigger. We're monitoring water quality over time, and we're seeing concentrations that are exceeding a median trigger. It suggests that water quality might be changing from what it has been historically. We also establish what we call peak triggers. Peak triggers are based on the 90th percentile, which is looking at the high values that we've seen in the historical data set. If we start seeing the high values that are getting higher, this can also be an early warning signal that there's something that we need to be paying attention to. So both the mean and peak triggers are used within this framework. So if you can imagine implementing this framework over the course of the first 3 years, for example, we would be collecting monitoring data at those 5 locations. Imagine this is the data from one sampling location, and we would be looking at those data and calculating those median values. We would then be comparing those median values to our trigger. If those concentrations, for example, in year 3, were exceeding those median values, this would be a flag for us to be paying attention and to initiate a management response under our framework. So taken together with the triggers and the limits, which are based on those most stringent water quality guidelines, we've got 2 thresholds that work together to give us information on how water quality is changing and to ensure that we are maintaining conditions within the range of historical. The intent in providing this background is to give you some information to inform your review of the table that you would have found in the engagement materials. So here's an example of the draft list of indicators, limits, and triggers for the Battle River. So to review, there's 2 types that I've spoken of today of management thresholds. The limits, that are the values that identify the concentrations where the risk of adverse effects is unacceptable. So these are the do not cross lines. And then there's triggers that provide that early warning signal that conditions may be changing from historical and there may be a need to pay attention. What I haven't spoken to in the presentation are management thresholds called targets. These have not been established yet under the framework, but we do have the ability to identify concentrations that we would like to see in the river in the future. Often these targets describe an improved water quality condition that we can work collaboratively together towards achieving. So I've talked about the regional objective of maintaining or improving water quality. I've talked about the indicators and some of the approaches that we use to select indicators under the framework. I've talked about 2 types of management thresholds that we can use to evaluate the condition of those indicators. And now I'm going to talk about the management response. The management response is a clear set of steps that we follow if management thresholds such as triggers and limits are exceeded. I'd first like you to pay attention to the table on the right. We call this our management intent table. So if we find that the concentration of indicator condition concentration or concentration is below the trigger value, we would put that in what we call management level 1. It suggests that the conditions in the river are at or better than historical conditions. If we find that conditions are exceeding that trigger value, we would put it in management level 2, which suggests that a trigger has been exceeded and an undesirable trend or issue may be developing. This will initiate a management response. If concentrations are exceeding a limit concentration, it puts it into management level 3, where the most stringent management response will be undertaken. We start our management response by moving through a series of steps. The first step in the management response is an investigation. Once we've investigated why a threshold has been crossed, we identify management actions, deliver those management actions, assess their implementation effectiveness, and throughout the process, communicate with the public in terms of where we're sitting. So when we're looking at an investigation, there might be some questions that we're looking to ask about why water quality has changed. We might be wondering if there were any rare natural circumstances that affected water quality in that given year. We might be looking more broadly and determining if there's emerging trends over time or whether there's something that we can see that's falling seasonally. So either winter under ice or as part of the spring runoff that seems to be the problem. We also might spend some time looking at the natural and human sources upstream of the sampling location that may be affecting the indicators. The investigation is ultimately seeking to identify the source of the issue. The source of the issue might bring us to focus on specific subwatersheds. In our investigation, we may also draw upon additional data sources. So I mentioned earlier that the LTRN stations that we use within the framework are not the only water quality monitoring that happens within the region. The Watershed Monitoring Program, this collaborative effort by Alberta Government and EPCOR, NSWA, and City of Edmonton have been collecting data on some of the tributaries. So we may be interested in accessing those data and information to give us some clues as to where what might be at the source of an issue. We would also be looking at data from other partners or community-based monitoring to inform an investigation of cause. I also mentioned that we might be looking at land use related activities at pressures in the watershed. So here, if you imagine there was an exceedance of a threshold at the Pecan station, we might be looking at land use pressures, including urban and rural development. So here you've got a map of some of the urban and rural development directly upstream from that station. If there was an exceedance on the Battle River, we may be looking at agricultural as a potential source for that exceedance, especially if it was a nutrient or a pesticide. If there was an exceedance of a threshold on the Clearwater station on the North Saskatchewan River, we may be looking at land use activities, including mining or forestry. The management actions that we take under a framework can range from education to stewardship to regulatory change. The most stringent actions are taken if a limit is approached or exceeded, and that makes a lot of sense. So you see this increasing stringency that can occur through stewardship actions to collaborative actions to regulatory actions. If we're working on stewardship actions, some examples there might include increased education. So education programs that can be delivered to reduce potential sources of contaminants to the river. Collaborative actions may be looking at new municipal programs or planning or policies that could be undertaken that would help mitigate impacts to surface water quality. So low impact development programs or riparian protection programs. We may want to be working together on additional monitoring programs that could provide additional information. Regulatory actions could look at reducing further wastewater effluent sources on the river system. It could be looking at enhanced policies, plans, or performance standards, or we could be looking at amending existing approvals or limiting new approvals if there was a serious issue. I wanted to give the example of a management response that was taken in the North Saskatchewan region, or the South Saskatchewan region, I should say, under the South Saskatchewan Region Surface Water Quality Management Framework. Under that framework, we saw a limit exceedance for total dissolved solids on the Milk River. Alberta Environment and Parks led an investigation supported by scientists across the government and outside experts. What we found is that the total dissolved concentrations were caused by natural sources, specifically groundwater influences to this river. We've written a technical report that will summarize some of the findings from this investigation, and this is going to be released in the summer of 2021. Our next steps are to do a risk assessment to evaluate the risk to aquatic ecosystem health due to these higher concentrations of total dissolved solids, and then determine whether any additional management actions are going to be necessary. So lastly, this brings me to reporting and evaluation. A really key component of implementing this framework is making sure that information is publicly available. So information on the water quality data that have been collected from these stations, synthesizing that data relative to those management thresholds. We will be doing that in what we call status of ambient environmental condition reports. This reporting would be released annually and provide information to the public. The data that are collected from those stations would also be available. We would also be committing to producing what we call status of management response reporting every 2 years. So where triggers or limits have been exceeded, We'll be reporting back to Albertans on some of the steps that have been undertaken through that investigation of cause or development of management actions to respond to those exceedances. This reporting would be available on alberta.ca. We are seeking your input on how you would like this information to be communicated as part of our survey. So moving on, I thought I'd briefly recap what a framework might look like in action. I've alluded to this annual implementation cycle. So essentially every year we're asking the question about whether we're achieving the objectives of maintaining or improving water quality within the river system. We'll be assessing the condition of the indicators through our monitoring. Through our collection of our monitoring data. We'll be comparing that condition against the management thresholds. Be initiating a management response, or that series of steps, including investigation, and then evaluating our action and reporting on that through our status of management response reporting. In terms of who's involved in framework implementation, Alberta Environment and Parks is accountable for coordinating and overseeing framework implementation. So our department, I should say, has responsibility in doing the monitoring and leading the monitoring, coordination and oversight of the management responses, and making sure that the reporting is completed. We work together with the Alberta Energy Regulator, Agriculture and Forestry, and Alberta Energy through this management response, and maybe working together with them on the implementation of key management actions. Indigenous communities, stakeholders, municipalities, industry, WPACs, we see there being lots of engagement and information shared on the management response reporting, and there may be support required for the delivery of some of these management actions. I also wanted to speak to the role of these frameworks in terms of informing decision-making. So decision makers will need to consider the findings from the framework reporting in land and natural resource decisions that are made. So they'll need to be considering, have we crossed any thresholds? If so, for which indicators? Which thresholds were crossed? Was it a trigger or was it a limit? Has a management response been initiated, and are we meeting the regional objective? Lastly, I wanted to be clear that the surface water quality management frameworks will be issued or given legal authority under the the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, and eventually under the Alberta Land Stewardship Act with the appropriate regional plan. So with respect to cumulative effects management, there are many current and ongoing activities and initiatives that have happened in this region. There has been previous engagement on the North Saskatchewan Region Surface Water Quality Management Framework, which is shown on this timeline in 2015, and there was some additional engagement that occurred in 2018. So at this point in time, we have brought in and considered the feedback that we received through that engagement, as well as some of the management direction that came through the Industrial Heartland and Capital Region Water Management Plan. So some of the previous stakeholder feedback that we've considered, are around the consideration of whether non-point sources are considered under this framework, and the answer to that is yes. People seeking clarity and information on what the current state of water quality is in the watershed and how it compares to the objectives. Providing clarity that these indicators are very closely linked to human pressures within the watershed. As examples, can WPACs be involved? Absolutely. So here's the engagement opportunity. Alberta Environment and Parks is seeking input on the identified regional pressures, the proposed regional objectives, the indicators and the approach for setting thresholds, the approach for management response if thresholds are crossed, and various aspects of the evaluation and reporting system. The survey is open until September 17th and can be found online at the following address. You'll also on that site find information on fact sheets for this framework. If there's interest for one-on-one meetings for key stakeholders or Indigenous communities, please contact us. And we also wanted to share with you that the input that we receive will be synthesized and shared back to participants on the alberta.ca website. With that, I will end and provide opportunities for questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah, so much for that presentation. So I will invite the panel to turn their videos back on, and we will move into our Q&A. And so just so folks are aware, we do have some support happening in the technical side and the back end this evening. So Jenna, Alyssa, Lisa, and Rob are all here sort of doing things in the background. So they're not going to have their video on because they're not responding to questions through our panel for this evening. So yeah, they're here supporting in the background, but not on the panel itself. So as I previously mentioned, we are going to go through some of the questions that were pre-submitted to start off, and I see we have a few questions that have come in so far through the Q&A. So if you haven't opened up the Q&A yet, please go ahead and do that now. It should be again on the black bar at the bottom or the top of your screen, and go ahead and type any questions that you have in there based on Sarah's presentation that she just gave. So as I mentioned, we're going to start off with some of the pre-submitted questions, and we'll kind of bounce back and forth between the live questions and the pre-submitted ones. So the first question that I have here actually comes from Mike, and his question is, will the North Saskatchewan Regional Plan be completed? Other regions with surface water quality management frameworks also have regional plans.
Hi, Janine. I'm happy to try to answer that question, and we do appreciate it, that question about regional planning. As we know, the government of Alberta has been responding to the effects of COVID-19 and addressing the need for economic recovery as a priority for the province. I can share with you that the government does remain focused on commitments and priorities of implementing the land use framework, the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, and the various elements we find under the framework and the Act, such as regional and sub-regional planning and land stewardship tools that are enabled through those documents. The sequencing of the remaining regional plans in the province has not been determined, but we do anticipate eventually continuing that work once current priorities are addressed and conditions stabilize.
Great, thank you, Kim. So our next question that was also pre-submitted comes from Michelle, and Michelle is wondering, how is climate change being considered in monitoring and our choice in indicators?
Yeah, thanks, Janine, and thanks for the question, Michelle. It's a good question. So these frameworks are not designed to address climate change directly. However, where you have potential climate change-induced shifts, say on land cover and or runoff regimes, in combination with whatever land use happens to be within that particular watershed, the resulting shifts in water quality signals that we measure through AEP's monitoring network are implicitly incorporated into that data. So it's an integrated signal of everything that's affecting water quality within the watershed. So if there are climate change aspects that are potentially changing the way, for example, land use or land cover interacts with water quality, then the exceedances, if we see them in the framework, may be an early sign that some land uses may need to be modified or adapted moving forward. And from a monitoring perspective, or from a monitoring design perspective, we have some other tools at our disposal that would support a management response that's triggered under the framework that obviously would leverage the monitoring data that we collect to better understand drivers of any shifts that we see in water quality. And those drivers may incorporate those climate change effects over the longer term.
Great. Thank you, John. And maybe if we could just get the panel, when you guys are responding, just because we have so many different folks, if you can just introduce yourself as you answer questions, that would be great too, just as we move throughout the evening here. So our next pre-submitted question comes from Shannon, and Shannon is wondering, how will this framework tie into the Stormwater Characterization Program and the Stormwater Technical Working Group, if at all?
So I can take that one. Thank you for the question, Shannon. My name is Greg Perkowski. I'm the Air and Watershed Resource Manager for the North Saskatchewan and Red Deer region. The Stormwater Characterization Project is a project designed to look at the types and concentrations of pollutants that are coming from municipal and industrial stormwaters. So we're looking at those two things separately, or municipal and industrial stormwater separately, because of the behavior of those systems, or the way that pollutants transport or stormwater leaves those industry or municipal sites is a little bit different. There's different controls and perhaps different pollutants. So that study is really designed just to look at the differences and what's really coming into the river from stormwater, from municipalities and from industry. There's a concurrent study that we're leading, also looking at effluent characterization, so looking at pollutants that are coming from point sources of say, a municipal wastewater treatment plant or some industry. So the idea behind those is just really to get a better understanding of the nature of the pollutants that are coming from those sources. So where those projects come from, or what they're intended to inform, is the water management framework for the industrial heartland and capital region. And that framework's been in place since 2008. So there's been a bunch of work that's happened within the kind of Edmonton and Fort Saskatchewan region industrial heartland around water quality management. So that water management framework will effectively be a sub-regional plan within the North Saskatchewan regional plan, or surface water quality management framework. So they will be related because it's kind of a sub-regional plan to the larger, what will be the regional plan, but for currently will be the water quality management framework. So the idea behind those is really just to get a better understanding of where pollutants might be coming from. So should a trigger be exceeded at one of those long-term monitoring stations within the river, then we don't have to start from ground level in terms of understanding what the potential sources for these pollutants where they might be coming from. And we can use these types of studies for information to help just inform a management approach to addressing the issue.
Great, thank you so much, Greg. So our next question here, we're going to move now into some of the live questions that have been submitted. So our first question here this evening comes from Bradley. Was any consideration given to monitoring Battle Lake itself to support the understanding of the water quality within the Battle River?
It's me again. Yes, John Owen here, Director of Watershed Sciences. Thanks for the question, Bradley. So again, another good one. So the way AEP approaches monitoring program design, depending on whether it's, say, water quality in the rivers, water quality in lakes, groundwater, hydromet, really varies quite a bit because we have to serve multiple needs and requirements for the use of that data. So in the case of Battle Lake specifically, the way the lake program is currently set up is that we tend to rotate water quality for lakes on a year-by-year basis. So in the event that in the Battle River, under this framework, if a trigger or a limit was kind of exceeded, or there was some indication that we were heading that way, and there was a management investigation into why, then that would likely trigger in an adaptive way us maybe going in and monitoring water quality at Battle Lake specifically. So that's kind of the way we try and approach our monitoring, is that we have core programs that are there, for want of a better word, in perpetuity, but we have to be adaptive within that to respond to either emergency events, or in this case, as I said, if there is a trigger exceedance within a framework.
Great. Thanks, John. Our next question here comes from Jesse. Can funding be provided for independent monitoring along the North Sask and Battle Rivers on an ongoing basis so that Indigenous or other groups can be an active stakeholder?
Thanks for that question, Janine. So this is Sarah DePoe, Director of Cumulative Effects Management Planning. Thank you for the question, Jesse. Alberta Environment and Parks does have a couple of examples of community-based monitoring programs, and we do want to continue to explore ways that we can get communities, including Indigenous communities, involved. Do we currently have funding set aside for this framework for independent community-based monitoring? Not at this time, but we would be happy to discuss further, and have definitely noted this comment.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Our next question here comes from Robert. Are surface water quantity management guidelines also going to be prepared? In general, would it not be helpful to have both types of guidelines developed, since water quality will be influenced by quantity or flow?
Thanks for that question, Robert. It is a very good question, as the relationship between water quality management and water quantity management is, of course, very important. The proposal right now is to introduce 2 new surface water quality management frameworks, but there are other approaches used in the province to manage water quantity, including water management plans. And as Sarah indicated in the presentation, the management frameworks that are being proposed are intended to add to the existing environmental management system in the province and complement those other pieces. So the intention is that these water quality frameworks would work hand in hand with existing approaches that we have to manage water quantity in the province as well.
Great. Thanks, Kim. And I just see here, just so folks are aware, so Dorta had asked a question here, just where can the draft water quality triggers and thresholds be found, that Sarah briefly presented, and Rob just provided a link in there. So you can actually find the indicator list on the alberta.ca webpage that we have. So if folks are wondering where that is, then you can find that online on that engagement page. So just wanted to point that out, that Rob had provided a written response to one of our questions that we have here. So we're going to go back to another pre-submitted question now. So how can the GOA, WPACs, and others do a better job of integrating the Water for Life strategy into municipal decision making?
Hi, it's Jacqueline Schmidt here from the Water Quality Policy section. Happy to attempt that response. So the environmental management frameworks we're talking about today provide a really critical integration point for Water for Life outcomes. Those are being the healthy aquatic ecosystems, safe, secure drinking water supply, and reliable quality water supplies. Government of Alberta, Alberta Water Council, Watershed Planning and Advisory Councils, Watershed Stewardship Groups, all of these, including municipalities, have a really important roles to play in implementing the Water for Life strategy. And I'd say the Government of Alberta is responsible for setting those strategic outcomes and priorities for water and land use management in the province and connecting the related planning initiatives. Municipal governments, on the other hand, are managing the land and water through land use planning with their respective boundaries through decisions like zoning, area structure plans, municipal development plans, and bylaws. This local approach, along with their management of drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure, make municipal governments an essential partner in our watershed management system. And just as a side note, I noticed that yesterday, the Alberta Water Council just released their results of the Water for Life implementation review yesterday. I can add the link to that on our chat here, or have one of our colleagues do that. But the review found that the action plan for Water for Life is largely complete, and there's several actions that have really become part of the daily business for everyone working in water management at all government levels and stewardship across the province. So the review noted that significant progress had been made towards the 3 goals related to Water for Life, though there's still some areas that require work, such as healthy aquatic ecosystems. One of the recommendations from the review specifically is to examine how the Water for Life partnership framework can be improved to contribute more effectively to water and watershed management in Alberta. So I think, the question of how municipalities factor into the system might be addressed through one of those recommendations.
Great, thank you, Jacqueline. Okay, so we're going to go back to another live question that was submitted this evening from Chris. Chris is wondering, how does this framework differ from the umbrella province-wide environmental water quality guidelines from 2018? Does it just provide more regional specific targets and limits?
Janine, I can work on answering this one. I thought that was a really good question. So, yeah, in the presentation today, we did refer to those province-wide environmental quality guidelines from 2018. And within that document, you'll find that there may be multiple guidelines that exist for sometimes individual parameters. So there may be guidelines for protection of aquatic life, for agricultural uses, for recreation. So in essence, in the framework, what we're doing is if there are multiple guidelines that exist for any given parameter, we're essentially selecting the one that is the most stringent for the indicator of interest, and we're saying that is the guideline that we're looking to manage towards for the river, for either the North Saskatchewan or the Battle River. So it is adopting those guidelines, but it's adopting the most stringent guideline for a variety of desired uses for that indicator for the region. So hopefully that helps to answer the question.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So looking at our next question here, so we actually have one pre-submitted question that's quite similar to a question that just came in from Jesse. So I'm just going to read them both out and then the panel can respond. So what is our benchmark to be where we are today and for the future is the first question. And that came from John. And the second question is from Jesse here this evening. In this presentation, the threshold is created from 10 years. Is this 10 years from the date of implementation of this framework? So if this framework is implemented in 2023, is the historical data collected starting from 2013? Is this a fluid threshold? Does it always move only 10 years from the current date, or would 2013 be the long-term established threshold, for example? And why only 10 years of historical data?
I could try to tackle that one. It's a lot of questions there. But effectively, what the regional objective is to maintain or improve water quality. So the period where we established the baseline period that's been established is the approximately 10-year period ending in about 2014. So that was ended there just because of the initial consultations for the North Saskatchewan Region Water Quality Management Framework started in earnest in about 2015. So it's picked up again lately, so some of the scientists within Alberta Environment had done some investigation of whether if we move that baseline period to 2019, what's the potential change of the indicators or the thresholds. And they found marginal change. So because we did a lot of engagement and a lot of study prior to 2015, or with that initial 10-year period of up to 2014, it's made the decision to establish that as our benchmark period. So effectively from this point forth, the goal for all the water quality indicators is to be as good or better than 2014 and prior. So that's really it. And then we're just as we continue on with our monitoring and with our investigations, we are just looking at whether or not we are in fact reaching our objective of maintaining or improving water quality. So this might change in other regions that have different objectives like use protection. Perhaps that's maybe a sliding benchmark period might be more appropriate for that regional objective. But with hours of maintaining and improving water quality, the idea would be to compare everything to that initial benchmark period.
Great, thanks, Greg. Cecilia, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Greg got it. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, everybody. So our next question comes from Claudia, and it's a pre-submitted question. So how often is the North Saskatchewan River water quality assessed, and where can the analytical data be reviewed or be viewed?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Claudia. So we have two networks, as Sarah mentioned in the presentation, within the NSR framework region. So we have the long-term river network, or LTRN for short, and the tributary monitoring network. So those stations are typically monitored on a monthly basis. Some of the tributary sites are only monitored during the open water season because they're smaller tributaries and they tend to freeze to the bed in winter, so there's actually no water to sample. But typically the LTRNs, which is what the framework is based off, are monitored on a monthly basis. In terms of kind of assessing that data and getting it into the public domain. So the frameworks currently produce ambient condition reports on an annual basis, and that's where we compare the current year's data to the historical baseline and do statistical analyses on where things are at from that perspective. So in terms of the water quality data itself, you can go onto the alberta.ca website, and if you search for either water quality data or water quality data portal, that will take you to a link where you can search via a map interface on the web all of the water quality stations that are currently that we've monitored with an AEP. You can right click on those and get a station inventory, which will tell you, how long the station's been there, what kind of data has been collected, and then if you actually want to see the data itself, all you need to do is send an email to the email address that's on that website, and they will supply the data sets back to you. And the same with the reporting, the framework reporting. That's also available publicly through the Open Government portal. And there's also other pieces as well that go beyond the framework reports themselves. So, there's other focus study results that may be staff within AEP, either themselves or in collaboration with universities, have published on specific aspects of water quality within different watersheds across the province. So that's all available on the Open Government portal.
Great, thanks, John. And I think some of that information is also linked in the fact sheets as well. So folks should be able to find that there on the engagement webpage too. So our next question here comes from Chris. When monitoring shows limits about thresholds or above thresholds maybe, how will thresholds triggers be managed or acted upon? The McLeod River report showed exceeded guidelines for years for a variety of measures downstream of coal mines that does not seem to have had much concrete action to correct over time, at least by information made available to the public.
I'll take this question, Janine. So Chris, I can speak to it within the context of the frameworks that we're developing. So in particular, so the example for the North Saskatchewan framework that we're talking about today. So we introduced the idea of doing the monitoring of the key suite of indicators at the stations over time, and doing that evaluation annually as to whether they are at or above the triggers or limits. If we find in that annual reporting, so beyond that annual cycle, that one of the indicators in the framework has exceeded either a trigger or a limit, that initiates that management response process. The initiation of the management response process is something that's led by our department, so Alberta Environment and Parks. We do have staff dedicated in each region to take the lead on working through that management response. So to collect any additional data that are required to better understand the reasons why the exceedance has occurred. And then to work through the process of identifying what would be the appropriate management actions to respond to the issue that's been identified. So so in a nutshell, that's more or less the process that would be established by having the frameworks in place.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So next up, we have two questions from Claudia here. So Claudia, I'll read them together because I think they're fairly closely related. So your first question is, what are currently the 3 most worrisome substances found in the North Saskatchewan River water, and what is being done to identify their source or origins and mitigate their potentially unhealthy impacts to wildlife and humans?
Good questions, Claudia, and tricky ones to answer. I think in terms of the three most worrisome substances, I think that largely depends on your point of view and in what context you're talking about. I think the key thing to kind of remember here with all of the parameters that we measure within the river systems is that there's a fair range of natural variability in those parameters as it stands now. And the driver of that variability is going to vary. Sometimes it's anthropogenic, sometimes it's natural. So I don't really have a 1, 2, 3 answer for you. But that is also part of why this framework is being put into place, because the indicators that are being selected and as part of this engagement process maybe be refined are there to basically give an indication of whether or not we are seeing worrisome trends in a number of different parameters. And if we are seeing those trends, then we have a management response in place to deal with that. And that kind of ties into the second question there. Around identifying source and origins and mitigating those. So part of the way that we design the monitoring within Alberta is that we have our long-term river network, and those stations have been in place for a long time, and they provide a larger scale indication of the cumulative impact of activities upstream of those points. So that data is invaluable, but it's at that large scale from a cumulative effects perspective. And this is where the tributary monitoring network piece comes in, because that brings us down to a slightly smaller scale to get a better handle on, well, what are specific tributaries bringing into the mainstem river. And the way that those programs have typically been designed, and this is specifically in the case of the NSR, is what we've done, and this is in partnership with EPCOR and the NSWA and the City of Edmonton, is to take a representative look at the tributaries. So the monitoring program that we have, and we have 19 stations on tributaries, those stations are representative of all the different kind of land use, land cover structures that we have throughout the North Saskatchewan River Basin. So those pieces, if there is a trigger or a limit exceeded in the LTRNs under the framework and a management response is triggered, that's where that data from the tributary monitoring network becomes really useful in helping to inform and support that management response.
Great, thanks, John. And thanks, Claudia, for the great questions as well. So our next question here comes from Stephen. How are municipal growth aspirations considered in the framework water quality objectives? For example, the City of Edmonton is aspiring to grow to up to 2 million people by 2040. Will objectives remain the same?
John Shear may be on mute. I know he wanted to respond to this question for Stephen, so he just might need to hit that mute button.
Sorry, folks. I'm looking at other questions as they're rolling in.
Do you want me to read the question again, John?
No, I think I'm okay, thanks.
Okay, that's good.
So yeah, basically municipal growth aspirations, and as they could impact guidelines or basically the objectives in the future, the answer to that is the objectives will remain the same. So with municipal growth aspirations, and I guess the shift in what we're doing today with the water quality management framework is understanding what the existing baseline is, and with that aspiration or that objective of maintain and improve, as we grow in population as well as development, we also anticipate innovation and improvements in the way that we manage water quality. So we will see growth, and the guidelines that we're measuring against may shift, but the objective, unless it's revised via a renewal or an update to the water quality management framework, should remain the same.
Great, thanks, John. So we'll switch back to another pre-submitted question here that came from Tracy. How will metrics and targets for land cover and use, including wetlands, be utilized in the surface water quality management frameworks?
think I'm going to take a stab at this one from Tracy. Thank you for the question, Tracy. So yeah, I think what you were alluding to was some of the information that we do have on land cover and land use that was identified in the presentation today. I think in the presentation today, we looked at some of the anthropogenic features on the landscape, but you're talking about looking at some of the natural features on the landscape and looking at the relationship between those natural features and land use characteristics and the relationship with surface water quality. And I think, definitely there's a connection there. In terms of establishing thresholds for the land use activity under the framework, I think that would be something that we would be exploring, and that would be part and parcel with the management response process. If we're moving through investigation of cause, finding certain portions of the watershed or specific sub-watersheds would benefit from some, reclamation targets or land use targets that would serve to improve water quality in the main stem rivers and help us achieve our objective, that would be something that would be reasonable to include within the scope of a management response under the framework. But yeah, speaking more conceptually to that than the specifics.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So we have another live question here from Lori. It is important to note that the North Saskatchewan River is a flow managed river. That is, the flow is managed for power generation primarily. What processes or agreements are in place to influence those flow decisions to manage the river ecosystem?
Thanks, Janine. And I think we should also roll this question into two parts, as Lori has another question that's also very much linked to the first question. So in answering this first question, we'll carry on after that. But essentially, there isn't an agreement in place currently with TransAlta, who operates the two dams on the North Saskatchewan, one being the Brazeau, another being the Bighorn. Having said that, operation of those dams has actually resulted in improved water quality through the winter months over years, and over the long term has likely resulted in reduced oxygen sag or dissolved oxygen sag that we normally see under low flow conditions and under ice. So we're seeing that what I would term a reverse hydrograph, where you have an increased flow in the winter at a time when we normally have actually reduced flow and natural flow scenario, is improving the water quality downstream by increasing the flow during those under ice conditions. So that's where we're at currently. And can you read Lori's second question as well, Janine?
I'm not seeing a second question from Lori.
The second part.
Unless it's one of the pre-submitted ones. We do have a pre-submitted question from Lori about how were the draft limits and triggers selected. But that's the only other one that I'm seeing from Lori.
Apologies, that wasn't the same one. I'll see if I can dig out, maybe there's a little bit more to it.
John, I can read you the question. It's Eleanor here.
Thanks, Eleanor.
The one you're referring to is, I think that one would speak to management response and how decision makers governing the flow regime would be included in developing management actions if flow is determined to be a big factor in quality conditions.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Yep.
And thank you, Lori. Yeah, no, that's the one I was looking for. So the answer to that question is absolutely, we would include the major proponents of that are managing flow on the river, which in this case would be TransAlta, an operation of both those dam structures. So if flow was investigated to be a contributing factor to reduced water quality or us crossing a limit or a trigger, then we would certainly bring TransAlta into the discussion and be working with them to address that.
Great. Thank you, John, and thanks, Eleanor.
Welcome.
So our next question comes from David. Has thought been given to more closely monitoring water immediately entering and leaving the city of Edmonton, since it likely has a disproportionate impact on many indicators? For example, the Bow River Phosphorus Management Plan seemed to indicate that although the levels of phosphorus overall were not increasing in the river, water leaving the city of Calgary, if my information is correct, had the most elevated levels of phosphorus in the system, with loading from the 3 municipal wastewater plants.
Apologies, got the wrong button. Yeah, I can take that one on. So I think that consideration is already baked into the proposed plan. So there are 2 monitoring stations within on the North Saskatchewan River that are before the city of Edmonton and after. So there's one at Devon, which is southwest of Edmonton, so it's right before the city of Edmonton, and then there's another one at Pecan, which is northeast of Fort Saskatchewan. So the plan is really looking at the cumulative effect of the city of Edmonton and the industrial heartland on changes to water quality within that defined stretch. Those 2 sites also make up the water management framework for the capital region and industrial heartland. And within that framework, we are doing a variety of studies as well, trying to characterize stormwater and effluent sources directly. So not necessarily looking at the cumulative effect, but just the individual effect of sources along that stretch of the river. So it's certainly something that is considered, recognizing, of course, that a major urban center and the industry around it is a major contributor to pollutants to that system.
Great, thanks, Greg. And we just have a follow-up question here from Jesse. Sarah, this was a response I think that you had provided about the thresholds before. It was stated that different regions may have a sliding benchmark for use protection. So does this mean that each framework is standalone and has its own set of different rules?
Oh yeah, I can answer that question. Thanks for following up, Jesse. So yeah, in terms of the surface water quality management frameworks that are developed within the province, so the one for Lower Athabasca region that exists already, the one for the South Saskatchewan region, and the one we're talking about tonight, the North Saskatchewan. And I alluded to the one that's being developed for the Upper Athabasca region. Yes, they are place-based. They are place-based frameworks. So we do engage on them individually in terms of what the regional objective is. So the objective of maintain or improve for the North Saskatchewan region is one that is specific to the region, and then we design and implement the framework in alignment with that. So yeah, I guess, and another aspect of that, so one aspect that is also place-based is going to be the calculation of those trigger values for the stations within a given region. Obviously, they're going to be dependent on what the historical concentration of those parameters has been within that region. So they will be site specific. But with respect to the limit values, we would be using a similar approach to limits. So for example, if you had lead in as an indicator in all of those frameworks, the limit value for lead would be the same. It would be the most stringent surface water quality guideline that exists for lead that would be applied as the limit in each one of those frameworks. So yeah, it's a bit of a hybrid, but there's some components that are consistent. So hopefully that answers your question.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And we have another question here from Bradley. Has any consideration been given to modeling future river water quality based on projected watershed development, industrial, urban, or agricultural, to allow for proactive management responses?
Hi, Bradley. I can take that question. With respect to future growth and understanding the future impacts of water quality on the North Saskatchewan River, we've got an initiative underway, in fact, to look at water quality with a 10-year growth model that'll go from basically the Devon to Pecan reach on the North Saskatchewan River. And this model will give us a good indicator of where we'll run out of road in terms of assimilative capacity and start to potentially impact our limits and triggers. So it's very important to be forward facing in terms of the way that we manage water quality specifically. And we've identified that early on, and we do have work underway currently to start looking at that. So hopefully that answers your question, and it was a good one.
Great. Thanks, John. So our next question here comes from Nicole. As land use, climate, and population pressures increase, I can only presume that water quality will degrade. What management actions, for example, land management or regulatory, can be taken proactively to maintain and improve water quality before we observe degradation?
Yeah, I can take that one as well. It's very much related to what John had just described about the importance of looking forward and the things that we're doing to understand the current state and evaluating growth models in relation to the total attenuation capacity of the river, which is how much pollutant that the river can take. Yes, it's absolutely right. The more we grow, the more or the stronger the likelihood of degrading water quality exists. So there's no easy answer to that. It really depends on the nature of growth and what where we expect pollutants to come from the landscape. So because where it comes from defines the tool that we can use to manage it. So if there's a lot of non-point sources, either from municipal stormwater, those are a lot different than industrial effluents that we have more precise instruments to use to deal with that from a regulatory perspective. So our management actions aren't all regulatory. They come in groups. So either stewardship actions, so education programs, or collaborative actions, working with our municipal partners around developing programs for stormwater management. Those are all things that we can do, and of course are continually ongoing, just with in the municipality themselves or different NGOs that are working in that space, like the Low Impact Development Partnership, are all making very good strides toward trying to manage water movement and water quality just by virtue of managing the landscape a little better. Great,
thanks, Greg. And we have another question here. Sorry if I pronounce your name incorrectly. Sheila, does Saskatchewan have expectations about water quality thresholds and limits delivered at the provincial border, and are these aligned with what's developing in Alberta?
So I can speak to that one. It's Jacqueline here from Water Quality Policy again. So yes, the Saskatchewan border with Alberta, we actually are part of a group called the Prairie Provinces Water Board. And so that's Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the federal government is involved there as well. And essentially that organization or governance structure monitors and reports annually against water apportionment and also water quality objectives at the borders between the three provinces. So they're using generally the objectives that are established nationally and are specific to each river. And I think the environmental management frameworks that we're proposing here, once those numbers would be established, would also be based on a lot of those same objectives. So good alignment between the two approaches. Obviously, Alberta may choose to have more stringent requirements in some cases, depending on the requirements of that particular river.
Great, thanks, Jacqueline. So I'm just looking at our time here and we have about 5 minutes left. So there is a question here from Travis. Wondering, do federal influences contribute to the selection of indicators, such as the list of toxic substances in Schedule 1 of CEPA?
Hi, Travis. I'm Cecilia Chung from Watershed Sciences, and I'll try to answer this question. So in choosing the indicators for the NSRP, parameters that were identified as variables of concern in existing agreements and reports were considered. While the CEPA was not directly referred to, we did look at agreements and reports that include the PBWB Master Agreement on Apportionment, the draft water quality objectives for the Battle River, the pilot water quality objectives and allowable contaminant loads for the North Saskatchewan River, as well as the proposed site-specific water quality objectives for the main stem of the North Saskatchewan River. So we can follow up with this question, and we can confirm whether how much the CEPA was referred to, but it wasn't. It was not a direct document that we looked at for the choosing the indicator for NSRP.
Great, thanks, Cecilia. So our next question here comes from Kyle. Do you anticipate that new monitoring and data obtained under this framework will be of assistance to updating integrated watershed management plans and state of the watershed reports?
Good question, Kyle. Short answer is yes. I mean, all of the data that's collected in the NSR and Battle River is publicly available. So, its intent there is to serve multiple needs. Obviously, in the context of today, we're talking about the frameworks and the generation of data for indicators, but the indicators are only a portion of what's actually monitored at each of these sites. I think in most cases it's about over 100 different parameters. So that data is publicly available to inform multiple needs, including state of watershed reports, academic research, stakeholder interest, whatever it might be. So, yes.
Great, thanks, John. And our last question of the evening here comes from Jeremy. Where does the use of freshwater used for industrial use, such as fracking, fit into framework planning?
I can take that one, Janine. Really good question, Jeremy. And I think this is also linked to other water allocations. So specifically for fracking, that would be a pretty large volume, likely temporary diversion license if required for one time. Otherwise, it would be a water license. But basically, it's a large volume of water that would be removed from the river and potentially impacting flows. However, flow is taken into account as well as other allocations on the river when we allocate water. So with respect to water quality, we've established a very strong link between water quality and water quantity in terms of flow and volume and timing of flows. And these things are all consideration when those allocations are completed and decisions are made around how water is allocated in Alberta and specifically the North Saskatchewan River. So the question in terms of how are we considering a large allocation like fracking related allocation in terms of water quantity? The answer is that it is considered, and those calculations and estimates are done by our hydrologists who work with approvals engineers to ensure that those water withdrawals don't have an impact on downstream water quality.
Great. Thanks, John. All right, so it looks like we've come to the end of our time here. So I'd really like to thank everybody so much for joining us this evening. I know during the summer it can be hard to give up an evening to spend some time in front of a computer, but we're very thankful for everybody for spending their evenings with us. So in terms of next steps, the recording of this webinar will be posted on our engagement webpage as well as our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to circle back and watch any of the the components from Sarah's presentation or review any of those sections again, please feel free to do that. Otherwise, as Sarah had mentioned, we do have our survey that is online, so that is available until September 17th. So open all summer long with plenty of time for you to be able to review all of the fact sheets and videos that are posted on that engagement webpage and resubmit submit your survey responses for that. So once again, thanks everybody so much for joining us this evening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you sometime soon, hopefully. Thanks everybody. Bye.